Hello and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Wyenberg. This time we begin our reading of Farther Afield by Miss Reed. This is part of the Fairacre series, Miss Reed's chronicle of the life of a school teacher in a little English village sometime in the 50s or 60s. Part 1, A Visit to Bent. Chapter 1, End of Term. "When do we come back?" said Joseph Coggs. He stood close by my chair, rubbing the crepe sole of his sandal up and down the leg. The rhythmic squeaking, as of mice being tortured, had already turned my teeth to chalk. I turned to answer the child, anxious to put us both at ease, but again I was interrupted. In the midst of the hubbub caused by end-of-term clearing up, Patrick and Ernest had come to grips and were fighting a silent but vicious battle. Without a word, I left Joseph, moved swiftly into the arena, and plucked the two opponents apart with a practiced hand. With a counter-movement, I flung them into their desk seats, where they sat panting and glowering at each other. Despite all the modern advice of the pundits about irreparable damage to the child's ego, I continue to use outdated but practical methods on an occasion like this, and find they work excellently. Sweet reasoning will not be any more effective with two young males in conflict than it will be with a dogfight on one's hand. The first objective is to part them, the second to find out why it happened. In this case, a revoltingly dirty lump of bubble gum had been prized from under a desk, and both boys laid claim to it. Both are well-nourished children from decent homes whose mothers would have been as disgusted as I was by this filthy and aged sweetmeat finding its way into their hands, let alone their mouths. I held out my hand, and Patrick put the clammy object into it. For once it landed in the wastepaper basket without mishap, and the incident was closed. Patrick and Ernest returned to their desk polishing, much refreshed by the tussle, and at last I found time to answer Joseph Coggs. "Term begins on September 5th, I told him. He sighed. "It's a long time," he said mournfully. "A very long time," I agreed, beaming upon him. No matter how devoted, dedicated, conscientious, and altogether noble a teacher is, I feel pretty sure that each and every one feels the same sense of freedom and relief from her chains when the end of term arrives. And of all end of terms, the most blissful is the end of the summer term, when 6 weeks or more stretch ahead free of timetables, bells, children, and their parents. 6 weeks in which to call your soul your own, to enjoy the garden, to think about next year's border plants and of stocking up the log shed, even perhaps a little house decoration and tidying cupboards, although the thought of Mrs. Pringle overseeing the latter operation cast a cloud upon the sunny scene. Mrs. Pringle, school cleaner and general factotum to Fairacre School, sometimes obliges by giving me an extra hour or two on Wednesdays. I greet her offers with mixed feelings. On the one hand, the house certainly benefits from her ministrations, but her gloomy forebodings and her eloquent dissertations on the deplorable way I manage my housekeeping affairs are enough to dash the stoutest hearts. I had already determined to assist Mrs. Pringle in her bottoming, as she terms a thorough cleaning, and to behave in as kind and Christian a manner as was possible under extreme provocation. If, as I knew from experience, Mrs. Pringle's needling became intolerable, I could always put some cheese, biscuits, and fruit in the car with the current book and that day's crossword puzzle to solve, and drive to one of the nearby peaceful spots, far from Mrs. Pringle's nagging tongue and the reek of unnecessarily strong disinfectant. After all, I told myself, I can take quite a lot of Mrs. P. It's when Mrs. Hope is dragged up and flaunted before me that I crack. Mrs. Hope was the wife of a former headmaster and had lived in the schoolhouse as I do now. She must have had a dog's life, for her husband drank, and she found solace in unceasing work in the little house. From dawn to dusk, from morning till night, Mrs. Pringle had told me far too often, Mrs. Hope kept at it, never without a duster in her hand, and anybody invited to tea was met on the doorstep and offered a clothes brush and a pair of slippers so as to not soil the place. I shouldn't think many returned. No, that's true, said Mrs. Pringle thoughtfully, but then Mrs. Hope was very particular who came to the house. This was a side swipe at me, whose door stands open for all to enter. Mrs. Hope, so I am told, was always at the washtub before 7, twice a week, and even scrubbed out the laundry basket each time. Like Mrs. Tiggywinkle, she was an excellent clear starcher, and naturally nothing, not even heavy bedspreads and curtains, was ever sent to the laundry. Mrs. Hope would have scorned such a thing, and anyway, laundries don't get the linen really clean, and what's more, they use chemicals. If she had said that the dirty linen was prodded by devils with pitchforks, she could not have sounded more scandalized. The introduction of Mrs. Hope into any conversation was usually breaking point for me, and I could foresee many alfresco meals whilst Mrs. Pringle was obliging. There are many places within a quarter of an hour's drive from Fairacre which make glorious picnic spots. There are hollows in the downs, shelters from the winds, where the views are breathtaking, and the clouds throw little shadows like scurrying sheep on the green flanks of the hills. There are copses murmurous with cooing wood pigeons, and fragrant with damp moss and aromatic woodland flowers. But my favorite spot is by the upper reaches of the river Cax, before it wanders into Caxley and threads between the rosy houses to find its way eastward into the Thames. Here the wild cresses grow in the shallows, their white flowers dazzling against the darker water. Little water voles splash from the bank into the stream, stopping occasionally to nibble a succulent shoot or to chase another of their kind. And here, too, a heron can be seen upstream, standing like some shabby furled umbrella, tall, gaunt, and motionless upon the bank. It is here, particularly on a sunny day, that its magic works most strongly. It is the balm of hurt minds. No human being is in sight. No human habitation distracts the eye. The slow-moving water flows at the same pace as it has always done, sheltering and giving life to fish, plants, and insects. Thirsty bees cling to the muddy brink. Dragonflies dart shimmering across the surface, and the swallows swoop to drink. Below, in the murk, among the drifting water weeds, the dappled trout lie motionless. Life in its infinite forms pursues its unchanging course, timeless and unhurried, and a man's cares fall from him as the things that matter, sunshine, moving water, birds and small beasts, come to cast their spell upon him. I was snatched from my reverie by Linda Moffat's voice. Where, she was demanding, should she put the 24 or so fish paste jars that she had collected and washed off of the nature table? Never use off of, I replied mechanically for the 2000th time that term. A losing battle this. I thought resignedly, one must soldier on. Having a lend of or a borrow of is a similar enemy, while she never lent me nothing or I never got teached proper pose particular problems to those attempting to explain the niceties of English usage. Try the map cupboard, I suggested, watching the child transferring a black smear from her hand to a freshly starched linen skirt. Poor Mrs. Moffat, I thought compassionately, and the child at home for 6 weeks. "Miss," shouted Ernest above the din, "it's home time." 2 minutes to finish clearing up, I directed fortissimo. Within 3, they rose for prayers. The classroom was bare, ready for Mrs. Pringle's ministrations during the coming week, and the wastepaper basket was overflowing. Hands together, eyes closed. I waited until the seats had stopped banging upright and the fidgeting had stopped. Lord, keep us safe this night, secure from all our fears. May angels guard us while we sleep till morning light appears. Amen. If this was taken at a more spanking pace than usual, why not? Ahead stretched freedom, fresh air, bathing and fishing in the infant cax, wrestling and jumping, rejoicing in growing strength, and no doubt eating all day long. Ice cream, potato crisps, biscuits, loathsome bubble gum in an endless stream. Make sure you take everything home and enjoy your holidays. When do you come back? September 5th, miss, they chanted. Very good. Good afternoon, children. Good afternoon, miss. And then began the stampede to get out into the real world, which was theirs for 6 whole weeks. I remained behind for a few minutes, locking drawers and cupboards and retrieving a few stray papers to add to the load in the waste paper basket. I locked the Victorian piano. How much longer would it hang together, I wondered. The tortoise stove stood cold and dusty now, but Mrs. Pringle's hand and plenty of blacklead would prepare it for the autumn term. There would be the familiar battle, I supposed, about the right day to light it, Mrs. Pringle playing for time, whilst I pleaded, cajoled, and finally ordered the stove to be lit. But what did that matter now? Seize the moments as they pass, said the poet. I intended to follow his sound advice, and locking the school door, emerged into the sunshine. There was a welcoming chirrup from Tibby as I entered the front door of the schoolhouse. He was at the top of the stairs, yawning widely, his claws gripping the carpet rhythmically as he stretched. Plain Wilton carpet costs an enormous amount of money, as I discovered when I was driven to replace the threadbare stair carpet last year. Tibby had seen to it that the top and bottom stair are generously tufted, much to the horror of Mrs. Pringle, and to my lesser sorrow. It is sad, I know, to see such maltreatment of one's furnishings, but one must look realistically at life. Either one has no cat and plain Wilton, or one has a cat and tufted Wilton. I preferred the latter. Tibby, I knew, had just risen from his resting place on my eiderdown, another habit which Mrs. Pringle deplores. Cat's fleas cause cholera, she told me once, with such conviction that I almost believed her. She followed up the attack with a vivid account of someone she knew who had allowed their child, or maybe it was their second cousin's child, to bite the skin of a banana. The result was a rash diagnosed on the spot by the doctor as leprosy, and the child was never seen again by the family. Although I did not believe a word of this cautionary tale at the time, so downright was Mrs. Pringle's manner whilst telling it that I still find myself opening a banana with careful fingers and making sure the children do the same. The cholera I have decided to ignore. A school teacher's life is too busy to follow up every precaution suggested, and in any case, Tibby, I tell Mrs. P. robustly, has no fleas. The cat sprang down the stairs and accompanied me into the kitchen, watching the kettle being filled, the tray being set, and all the familiar routine leading to a few drops of milk in a saucer for him as I drank my tea. A quarter of an hour later, my second cup steaming beside me, I watched him as he lapped. Eyes half closed in bliss, his pink tongue made short work of the milk. We've broken up, Tib, I told him, broken up at last. I leant back and thought idly about the 101 domestic affairs I must see to. There was Mr. Willett to consult about a load of logs, and then I had promised the vicar I would play the organ whilst the regular organist, Mr. Annett, had his annual holiday. I must check the dates. And the sitting room curtains were in need of attention. Ever since their return from the cleaners, the lining had hung down a good 3 inches, so that even I had been irritated by their slipshod appearance. Then I really ought to tidy all the drawers in the house. The kitchen table drawer jammed itself stubbornly on the fish slice every time it was opened. But where would the fish slice go? and the paper bag drawer had so many stuffed into it that half of them had fallen over the back into the bottling jar cupboard below. Never mind. I told myself bravely, with all this time before me, the place would soon be in apple pie order. Why, I might even get round to labeling all those holiday prints of yesteryear before I clean forgot the names of the places. It was pleasant lying back in the armchair, reviewing all the jobs waiting to be done, confident that all would be accomplished in the golden weeks that lay ahead. I should tackle them methodically and fairly soon, I told myself, stretching as luxuriously as Tibby. No need to rush, and later on I should take myself for a short holiday somewhere pleasant. Wales, perhaps, or Northumberland, or the Peak District. Or what about Dorset? Very attractive, Dorset, they said. Near to slumber, I basked in my complacency. The teapot cooled, the cat purred, and a bumblebee meandered murmurously up and down the lavender hedge outside. Months later, looking back, I realized that that blissful hour was the highlight of the entire summer holiday. Chapter 2. Struck Down. Dawn breaks with particular beauty on the first day of the holidays, no matter what the weather. On this occasion, the sun fairly gilded the lily, rousing me with its beams and dappling the dewy garden with light and shade. I took my coffee cup outside and sniffed the pinks in the border. This was the life. Even the thought of Mrs. Pringle, due to arrive at 9:30 for a bottoming session, failed to quench my spirits. Across the empty playground stood the silent school. No bell would toll today in that little bell tower. No jarring foot would jangle the metal door scraper. No yells, no screams, no infant wailings would make the air hideous. Fairacre School was as peaceful as the graveyard nearby, a place of hushed rest, of gathering dust, given over to the little lives of spiders and curious field mice. Not for long, of course. Within a few days, Mrs. Pringle would begin her onslaught. Buckets, scrubbing brushes, sacking aprons, kneelers, and a lump of tough yellow soap prized from the long bar with a shovel, with an array of bottles containing disinfectant, linseed oil, and vinegar, and other potions of cleanliness, would assault the peaceful building under the whirlwind direction of Mrs. Pringle herself. Woe betide any stray beetle or ladybird lurking behind cupboards or skirting boards. By the time Mrs. Pringle's ministrations were over, the place would be as antiseptic as a newly scrubbed hospital ward. In the far distance, I could hear sheep bleating and a tractor chugging about its business. A car hooted, a man shouted, a dog barked. The life of the village went on as usual. The baker set out his new loaves, the butcher festooned his window with sausages, the housewife banged her mats against the wall, and the liberated children beset them all. Only I, it seemed, was idle, glorying in my inactivity as happily as the small ruffled robin who sat sunning himself on a hawthorn twig nearby. But such pleasant detachment could not last. St. Patrick's had long ago struck 9 o'clock, and the crunch of gravel underfoot now told of Mrs. Pringle's arrival. I sighed and went to greet her. Mrs. Pringle's black oilcloth bag, in which she carries her cretonne apron and any shopping she has done on the way, was topped this morning by a magnificent crisp lettuce the size of a football. "Thought you could do with it," she said, presenting it to me. "I know you don't bother to cook in the holidays, and I noticed all yourn had bolted. Willett said you was to pull 'em up unless you wanted to be run over with earwigs." I thanked her sincerely for the present and the second-hand advice. "Tell you what," went on the lady, struggling into her overall, "if you pull 'em up just before I go, I can throw 'em to my chickens. They can always do with a bit of fresh green." I promised to do so. "Well, now," said Mrs. Pringle, rolling up her sleeves for battle, "what about them kitchen cupboards?" "Very well," I replied meekly. "Which shall we start on?" Mrs. Pringle cast a malevolent eye upon the cupboards under the sink, those on the wall holding food, and the truly dreadful one which houses casseroles, pie dishes, lemon squeezers, and ovenware of every shape and size, liable to cascade from their confines every time the door opens. "We start at the top," Mrs. Pringle told me, "and work down." She sounded like a competent general issuing orders for the day to a remarkably inefficient lieutenant. I watched her mount the kitchen chair, fortunately a well-built piece of furniture capable of carrying Mrs. Pringle's 14 stone. "Get a tray," directed the lady, "and pack it with all this rubbish as I hand it down. We'll have to have a proper sorting out." "Get a tray," directed the lady, "and pack it with all this rubbish as I hand it down. We'll have to have a proper sort out of this lot." Obediently, I stacked packets of gravy powder, gelatin, haricot beans, semolina, and a collection of other cereals and dry goods which I had no idea I was housing. Now, why would I have 3 packets of arrowroot? I wondered aloud. "Bad management," snorted Mrs. P. There seemed no answer to that. "And half of this stuff," she continued, "should have been used months ago. It's a wonder to me you haven't got weevils or mice. I wouldn't care to use this stuff myself. That firm went out of business just after the war." I threw the offending packet into the rubbish box, a soft Cerberus. "Ah," said Mrs. Pringle darkly, "there'll be plenty more to add to that by the time we've done." It took us almost an hour to clear all 3 shelves. Mrs. Pringle was in her element, wrestling with dirt and disorder, and glorying in the fact that she had me there under her thumb to crow over. I can't say that I minded very much. Mrs. Pringle's slings and arrows hardly dented my armor at all, and it was pleasant to come across lost commodities again. "I've been looking everywhere for those vanilla pods," I cried, snatching the long glass tube from Mrs. Pringle's hand. "And that bottle of anchovy essence." "It's as dry as a bone," replied Mrs. Pringle with satisfaction. "And so's this almond essence bottle, and the capers. What a wicked waste. If my mother could see this, she would turn in her grave. Every week the cupboards was turned out regular, and everything in used brought forward, and the new put at the back. Method, she used to say. That's all that's needed, my girl, method. And it's thanks to her I'm as tidy as I am today," said my slave driver smugly. "My mother," I replied, "died when I was in my late teens. But if I imagined that this body blow would affect my sparring partner, I was to be disappointed." "It's the early years that count," snapped Mrs. Pringle, throwing a box of chocolate vermicelli at my head. I gave up, and we continued in silence until the cupboard was bare. Then I was allowed to retreat upstairs to dust the bedrooms while Mrs. Pringle attacked the shelves with the most efficacious detergent known to man. And we will follow Mrs. Pringle and Miss Reed further into the war of spring cleaning next time.